I have a 6 and 3-year-old boy, and I was imagining. I was imagining it was one of them that got shot, and the other saw it. I'm so sorry.
That was Andrew Yang, overwhelmed with emotion while hearing one victim's personal story of being impacted by gun violence. And the Democratic presidential candidate joins us now. Andrew, obviously a very moving moment for you. Talk about being out on the campaign trail and getting to meet so many people who are having so many challenges, and obviously that the greatest of them all. Talk about how that's changed you and how it's impacting you on the campaign trail.
Well, that moment was just a very human moment as a parent, listening to this mother's story about how one of her children was shot in front of the other, and just thinking about what that would mean for a family. And that footage is only 2 days old, so the moment is still fresh. I was just with my kids, and I hugged them a little extra tight yesterday. It's just a human response, and this sort of phenomenon cannot be allowed to be possible in this country.
Yeah. How has this campaign, moments like that, talking to other Americans who are struggling to get by every day, if they have a small business, to make payroll every 2 weeks, if they've got kids that they want to get to college but they can't afford that, or if they're young kids or young students that are worried about paying off their debt, how has that impacted you as a person and as a candidate?
Well, it's an incredible journey running for president, because you meet thousands of Americans across the country in all sorts of circumstances, and many of them bring to you their stories of loss, their stories of struggle. And if you're frankly, any kind of decent human being, like, you can't help but grow through that process. I knew that there were deep problems in our country, but the deeper you go, unfortunately, the more serious the problems become. We have to start focusing much more on solutions and how we can improve the lives of so many Americans around this country.
So, Andrew, it was interesting, even on my small level, when I knocked on doors running for Congress years and years ago. It didn't take too many doors, knocking on too many doors, to figure out what issues were the most important to people. After 4 or 5 doors and 4 of the 5 people saying the same thing, I knew pretty quickly, didn't need to take a poll to figure out what mattered to working class Americans. What is that one issue that you keep hearing coming up when you're meeting voters, when you're meeting American citizens? What is the top issue on their mind in the summer of 2019?
I think the issue on their minds is, why does it feel like they're working harder and harder and that they're never getting ahead? Why does it feel like the future they're giving to their kids is not as bright as even the future that they'd experienced when they were growing up in this country? That, to me, is the central issue that got Donald Trump elected, and it's still with us. And unfortunately, we need to start getting into the roots of these problems, because even if the Democrats successfully defeat Donald Trump in 2020, which we're going to do, the problems will still be with us. We have to start actually focusing on the solutions that we're going to improve the people's lives on the ground, because they don't feel like their work is getting them where they want to go.
Jeffrey Greenfield is with us and has a question for you. Jeffrey.
Okay, so anyone who saw what you saw and heard what you heard would be affected. And we've seen over and over again that when it's personal, there's a massive response. But the conditions that you describe, it seems to me, are the result of many, many years of macro policies, ranging from taxes to the weakening of unions to the technological changes of which you've been so big a part. So when you move from these dramatic moments to public policy, it seems to me that both parties bear a heavy share of responsibility for what has happened, since it's happened under both watches, and that it's much harder to convince people of these macro changes than it is to say, help that poor young girl.
Well, I think there's a real appetite in America now for solutions that are macro. And I agree with you completely that both parties share responsibility and that these issues have been decades in the making. I mean, if you look at the share of wealth and income that's accrued to the top of our society, it's been going on through Democratic and Republican administrations over the last number of decades. And Americans do mistrust now that the system's working for them, and that's very, very hard to get back. Like, you can't magically reconstitute trust. And so this is going to be a massive set of challenges for us for years to come, regardless of who's in the White House.
So you spoke obviously very emotionally about the aftermath of gun violence. What are some policies you want to see? I want to control guns. And I want to zero in on one in particular. You have said that you want to upgrade guns to have gun owners personalize their weapons. Explain to us what that means and how possibly you could get that done and pay for it.
I'm aligned with Democrats in terms of the big legislative goals. We need to have universal background checks and red flag laws and ban automatic weapons. But the reality is we have over 300 million firearms already in this country. About one for every man, woman, and child, and whatever law we pass, those firearms are still out there. So how do you decrease supply? How do you make those guns safer? We should have a perpetual buyback, in effect, where anyone who wants to sell their gun gets some money, and then you can start reducing supply. The other thing you can do in this personalization of guns, you can make a grip that essentially knows whether it's the owner based upon the size of their hand, the pressure. It's not a fingerprint thing. It's just like essentially the dimensions of your hand. And then if someone else tries to fire the gun, then it doesn't work. And this sounds very James Bondish, but the technology is very, very much available. It's just the gun manufacturers have not felt like it was going to be good for their businesses to have this. And this technology has become controversial because of inflammatory arguments on both sides.
Would it be required to do that? Just as a quick follow-up, would gun owners have to do that, submit their guns to have that sort of personalization?
That would be optional, but a lot of owners would love it, because who doesn't want a gun that's just yours? And a lot of gun owners have children. They know their children get a hold of the gun and tragedies can occur. So if you were to make it cost-free, you would see hundreds of thousands of these guns become personalized and then much, much safer.
You know, Mike Barnacle, I've heard statistics that only 3 or 4% of the crimes that are committed are actually committed with people who purchased the gun used in that crime. And it's so fascinating that here we are in 2019 talking about how you've got a president and a majority leader who won't do haven't done what 90% of Americans have wanted to do on background checks. Go back 19 years. George W. Bush, considered to be a pretty conservative guy, a very popular Republican, he supported that fingerprint technology in 2000. He supported expanded background checks. He supported a ban on military-style semi-automatic assault-styled weapons. He did. And here we are 19 years later, and you look at what 3 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., working for gun makers and hedge fund owners who own these gun companies have been able to do to twist and distort the debate. They've taken it in a direction that has obviously been to the benefit of a lot of people who wanted to walk in, buy the deadliest weapon they could buy and kill as many people as they could.
Sure, Joe, and we will be talking about this issue for several days, and the Senate and the House won't be back until after Labor Day. When they come back after Labor Day, there'll be an entirely new issue on the table, and this will have receded to a back burner. That's the way it's all gone for 50, 60, 70 years. Andrew, I have a story and a question for you, and the story is old. It's probably 30 years ago this summer on a hot Saturday night in the Roxbury section of Boston, Massachusetts. 7-year-old boy is shot on the stoop of his home. The detective sergeant, homicide detective sergeant, in that case, I remember it clearly because it was so vivid to me. His name was Herbie Spellman, and he told me, you know, he said, most people, when things like this happen, they say, well, the kid was in the wrong place at the right time. This kid was sitting on the stoop of his home. He was in the right place at the wrong time. This happens every single day in every big city in America. And often the victim is a young kid. These stories appear in agate type in the newspapers. People don't read about them. They're often, almost always, members of a minority. We don't understand it. We don't hear about it. We don't read about it. What can be done about the culture of homicide in this country, where we don't notice things unless it's children being shot in schools in Connecticut, or El Paso, people being shot simply because they're Mexican. But there's a culture in this country where we don't comprehend the viciousness of what is going on.
I was just with a gun activist in Baltimore, and Antonio Moore, and he said that often in Baltimore the shooter is a victim too. And that's what's happening in so many of these communities, where the communities have lost their way forward, and so many young people have then fallen into a culture of gun violence that affects, again, kids sitting on their stoop. It's unacceptable. We have to go into these communities and rebuild them economically and socially and culturally from the ground up. It's a very tall order, but we can do it. We know what we need to do. We just need to have the will to put those resources into work.
All right, Andrew Yang, we thank you for coming on the show. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Andrew, and we hope you will come back sometime very soon.
Thank you,
Coming
Joe.
up, Beto O'Rourke continues to hammer the president in the wake of the El Paso shooting. More from the campaign trail next on Morning Joe. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.